The lawyer slid the envelope across the polished kauri table, and inside was a name written in faded ink that would change everything I thought I knew about loyalty, blood, and what it means to be chosen. My hands shook as I read it. My own name, Harold Whitcombe. Sole heir to an estate I had never asked for, given by a man I had served for only 11 months, while the son I had raised for 43 years had thrown me out of my own house in Tauranga like I was nothing more than a stray dog clinging to the back porch. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where the grief began. Because every story like mine begins with a loss, and the loss came on a wet morning in late autumn when the pohutukawa trees outside our bedroom window had already shed their last red blossoms onto the lawn. My wife Eleanor passed in her sleep on the 14th of May. 41 years we had been married. She was 66. I was 68. The doctor used the word peaceful, and I suppose for her it was, but for me it was the opposite. Peaceful is what you call a thing when you have nothing to compare it to. I had spent 4 decades waking up to her humming in the kitchen, to her bare feet padding across the floorboards, to the smell of her tea brewing before the kettle had even properly whistled. Peaceful was not the word I would have used for the silence that came after. Our son arrived from Auckland the next afternoon. Bradley, 43 years old, a property developer with a Range Rover and a wife named Felicity, who spoke to me as if I were a child. She was trying not to upset. Their 2 children, Mason and Tilly, stood by the door with their phones out, not crying, not really there at all. I noticed this and I tried not to mind. Grief makes monsters of us all in different ways. Bradley hugged me. It was the first time he had hugged me in perhaps 4 years. He smelled of expensive aftershave and something else. Something I would only later identify as calculation. He whispered into my shoulder that everything was going to be all right. That he would take care of me now. That I should not worry about a thing. I should have worried about everything. The funeral was held at the small Anglican church in Bethlehem, where Eleanor had sung in the choir for 30 years. The vicar spoke of her kindness, of the meals she had cooked for grieving families, of the way she had mended the hymnal covers with her own hands. People I had not seen in decades came up to me and pressed casseroles into my arms. A neighbor brought a pavlova, someone else brought scones. I accepted everything and remembered nothing. That night, after everyone had gone, Bradley sat me down at the kitchen table where Eleanor had peeled potatoes and helped grandchildren with their homework and written Christmas cards by hand for as long as I could remember. He had a folder with him. Manila. Neatly tabbed, he said, "Dad, we need to talk about practical matters." I said, "Bradley, your mother has been gone 3 days." He said, "Exactly. And we cannot afford to delay. The house is too big for one person. The garden is too much. You are 68 years old, and you have just had a terrible shock. Felicity and I have discussed it. We think the best thing for everyone is for you to come and live with us in Remuera. We have the granny flat at the back. You will have your own space. The grandchildren will see you every day. You will not be alone." I remember staring at him. I remember thinking that he had inherited his mother's hazel eyes, but not her warmth. I remember saying, "I have lived in this house for 37 years. He said, "And that is precisely the problem. Too many memories. They will eat you alive, Dad. Trust me. I have seen this happen to other men your age. They sit in their empty houses, and they wither away. We are trying to save you from that." I did not have the strength to argue. I think that was what he was counting on. Within 2 weeks, the house in Tauranga had been listed with an agent. Bradley said it would sell quickly, and that the proceeds would secure my future. He said he would handle everything because he was a property developer and he knew the market, and I was in no fit state to be making financial decisions. I signed papers. I did not read carefully. I now understand that this was the first mistake of many, but at the time, the papers seemed to be about the agent's commission and the timeline of settlement. not about the deed itself. I packed Eleanor's things into boxes. 41 years of a woman compressed into cardboard. Her cardigans still smelled of her perfume, that lily of the valley one she had worn since the 70s. Her recipe books had her handwriting in the margins. I packed it all and I labeled it all, and I cried over each box, and I told myself that I would unpack her again in the granny flat in Remuera, and her things would make a new home. The granny flat in Remuera was not a granny flat. It was a converted garage with a bed, a microwave, a kettle, and a toilet that flushed unreliably. The window looked out onto a high wooden fence. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Bradley and Felicity arguing in the main house most evenings, and I could hear the children's video games at all hours, and I could hear Felicity's mother visiting on Sundays and complaining about the smell of my cooking carrying across the courtyard. The first month, Bradley was civil. He brought me cups of tea on Saturday mornings. He invited me to dinner in the main house twice. The grandchildren said hello when they passed me in the driveway. I told myself that I had been wrong to dread this, that grief had made me suspicious, that my son was doing his best. The second month, Felicity began to leave lists on my door. Tasks for the day: mow the lawn, clean the pool filter, take Mason to rugby practice because she had Pilates, pick up dry cleaning. The lists were not requests. They were instructions, written in her round looping hand on yellow sticky notes that I peeled from the door each morning, like a man collecting his own sentencing. I did the tasks because what else was I to do? I told myself I was being useful. I told myself that this was the natural order of an extended family, that fathers helped sons, that grandfathers earned their keep. I had grown up on a sheep farm in the Vaira Rapa, where everyone worked Ipin sunrise and no one complained. I could push a mower and pick up dry cleaning. I was not too proud for that. But pride, I would learn, is not what gets stripped from a man first. The first thing that goes is the belief that the people you love see you as a person. The third month, Bradley came to the garage one evening. He did not knock. He sat on the edge of my bed, and he looked at me with those hazel eyes that should have been kinder, and he said, "Dad, we need to discuss your contributions to this household." I said, "Contributions?" He said, "Yes. The cost of having you here is not insignificant. Power, water, food, insurance. Felicity has been keeping a tally. We think it is fair that you contribute something from your pension each fortnight. $600. That is less than half of what a rest home would charge." I said, "Bradley, the proceeds from the Tauranga house. That money was meant to secure my future." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, there are no proceeds. The house was mortgaged to the eyeballs. You signed the papers. The bank took everything. There is nothing left." I felt the floor tilt. I gripped the edge of the bed. I said, "That house was paid off. Your mother and I made the final payment in 2014. I have the letter from the bank framed in the hallway." He said, "Well, Dad, things change. Equity gets drawn down. There were extensions, weren't there? The conservatory. The new kitchen. You and Mom took out a line of credit. You probably forgot. You are getting older. These things happen. We had never taken out a line of credit. The conservatory had been built in 1998 with money from Eleanor's mother's estate. The kitchen had been done in 2010 with our own savings. I knew this. I knew this with absolute certainty. But Bradley was speaking with such confidence, and I was so tired. And Eleanor was not there to confirm what we both knew. And for one terrible moment I doubted myself. I doubted my own memory. I doubted the framed letter that had hung in my own hallway. I said nothing. I gave him the $600 from my next pension payment. I gave it to him every fortnight after that, for nearly a year. The fourth month, the slap came. It was a Tuesday. I had taken Tilly to her ballet lesson, and I had been 5 minutes late picking her up because the traffic on Great South Road had been worse than I had expected. Felicity rang Bradley. By the time I returned with Tilly, Bradley was waiting in the driveway. He was wearing his work clothes, his suit jacket still on. He said, "What the bloody hell is wrong with you?" I said, "Bradley, I am sorry." The traffic was. He did not let me finish. His hand came up and across my cheek before I understood what was happening. The sound was sharp. Tilly was still in the back seat of the car, with her ballet bag on her lap, and her eyes wide, and her 10-year-old face frozen between confusion and something else I could not name. My hearing aid fell out and skittered across the concrete. Bradley said, "You are useless. You are completely useless. We took you in out of the goodness of our hearts, and you cannot even pick up my daughter on time. From now on, you are going to earn your keep properly. You will wash my car every Saturday. You will maintain the garden. You will do the school runs without complaint. And if you do not like it, you can sleep on Queen Street with the rest of the rough sleepers. There is no Tauranga house to go back to. There is no money. There is just this. Do we understand each other?" I bent down and picked up my hearing aid. The plastic casing was cracked. I said it because Tilly was watching, and I did not want her to see her grandfather crumble in a driveway in Remuera on a Tuesday afternoon. I straightened up and I walked into the garage and I closed the door, and I sat on the bed, and for the first time since Eleanor died, I cried until I could not breathe. That night I lay awake and I thought about the framed letter from the bank. I had packed it. I knew I had packed it. It was in box number 23, the one labeled study. Bradley had told me he had put my boxes in storage in Penrose and that I could not access them because the storage company required photo ID and an account number that he had set up in his own name for tax purposes. I had not questioned this. I questioned it now. The next morning, I rang the storage company myself from the public phone outside the dairy on the corner because I did not want to use the cordless in the granny flat where Felicity might pick up the extension. I gave them my name. I gave them my date of birth. I asked if there was an account in my name. There was not. I asked if Bradley Whitcombe had an account. He did not. There were no boxes in Penrose. There never had been. I walked back to the granny flat in a kind of trance. I sat on the bed. I tried to think. 41 years of Eleanor's life, my study, my photographs, my parents' wedding portrait, the rugby trophy I had won at school in 1971, the framed letter from the bank, all of it gone. He had thrown it away. He had put my entire history into a skip, and he had told me it was safe in storage, and I had believed him because he was my son, and I had not yet understood that being someone's son does not make you incapable of cruelty. I needed to leave. But I had no money beyond my pension, no friends in Auckland because we had always lived in the Bay of Plenty, and nowhere to go. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the public library on Remuera Road, and I sat at one of the computers, and I searched for live-in caregiver positions for elderly clients. I did not have qualifications. I did not have experience. But I had spent the last 6 months of Eleanor's life caring for her when the cancer came back, and I knew how to lift a person and how to manage medication and how to sit beside someone who is afraid in the small hours of the morning. There was an advertisement near the bottom of the 3rd page. A private residence in Parnell. Live-in companion required for an elderly gentleman of independent means. 12-hour shifts. 4 days on, 3 days off. Accommodation provided. Discretion, essential. References preferred but not required. Immediate start. I rang the number from the library phone. A woman with a clipped English accent answered. She introduced herself as Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper. She asked me 3 questions. Was I sober? Was I patient? Did I have a problem with old men who were sometimes rude? I said yes, yes, and no. She said come for an interview at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The house in Parnell was a Victorian villa, set back from the road behind a wrought iron fence and a hedge of camellias. The gravel drive crunched under my shoes. Mrs. Henshaw met me at the door. She was perhaps 60. Gray hair in a bun, a cardigan with a brooch. She looked me up and down and she said, "Well, at least you are clean, and you have manners. Come and meet Mr. Ashbourne." Mr. Ashbourne was 87 years old. He was sitting in a leather wing chair beside a fireplace that was unlit because it was October and unseasonably warm. He had a tartan blanket across his knees and a glass of single malt in his hand at 4 in the afternoon. He had the bluest eyes I have ever seen on a human being and a voice like gravel under tires. He looked at me and he said, "What is your name, sir?" I said, "Harold Whitcombe," he said. "And what brings a man of your evident vintage to seek employment at this stage of his life, Mr. Whitcombe?" I told him the truth. Not all of it. I did not tell him about the slap or the granny flat or the storage company. I told him my wife had died, that I had moved to Auckland to be near my son, that the arrangement had not worked out, and that I needed work and a place to live. I told him I had cared for my wife in her final illness, and that I was not afraid of the difficult parts of looking after a sick man. He listened without interrupting. When I had finished, he said, "Mr. Whitcombe, do you play chess?" I said, "Badly." He said, "Excellent. I cannot stand losing to people who are good at it. You may begin tomorrow morning at 8. Mrs. Henshaw will show you to your room." My room was on the second floor at the back of the house, overlooking a garden with a magnolia tree and a stone bird bath. There was a single bed with a quilt that had been hand-stitched. There was a writing desk. There was a bookshelf with a Bible and a complete set of Patrick O'Brien. There was a window that opened. After 8 months in the converted garage in Remuera, it felt like a palace. I did not tell Bradley I was leaving. I packed the small suitcase I had been allowed to keep. I left the hearing aid he had broken on the bedside table, and I walked out of the granny flat at 6 o'clock in the morning while the household was still asleep. I left no note. I owed him no explanation. The work with Mr. Ashbourne was demanding but never demeaning. I helped him bathe and dress in the mornings. I read to him from the newspaper because his eyes were no longer reliable. I walked beside him in the garden when the weather permitted, his hand on my elbow, his pace careful but determined. I learned that he had been a barrister, then a King's Counsel, then a judge of the High Court. He had retired 20 years earlier. His wife Margaret had died of a stroke in 2009. They had no children. He had 2 nieces in England whom he had not seen in 15 years, and a nephew in Australia who rang twice a year, always around the time the will was discussed, never otherwise. We played chess every evening. I lost most of the games, but I won enough to keep him interested. He told me stories about cases he had presided over, about junior counsel who had gone on to greatness, about a particular morning in 1978 when he had been fishing in the Tongariro and had caught a brown trout the size of his forearm. He asked me about Eleanor. I told him everything. He listened the way Eleanor used to listen, which is to say, completely. One evening in the 3rd month, after Mrs. Henshaw had gone home and the house was settling into its night sounds, Mr. Ashbourne looked at me across the chessboard and he said, "Harold, you have not asked me a single personal question since you arrived, but I have asked you a great many. Why is that?" I said, "You are paying my wages, sir." "It would be impertinent," he said. "Nonsense. I am asking you to be impertinent. Tell me what you actually think of me." I said, "I think you are a man who has been very lonely for a very long time and who is too proud to admit it." He was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the board and he moved his bishop and he said, "Checkmate in 3. And by the way, you are quite right. We became friends. I do not know what else to call it. He was 40 years older than my own son, and he treated me with more respect than my own son had shown me in 20 years. He asked my opinion on the news. He insisted I eat dinner at the table with him rather than in the kitchen with Mrs. Henshaw. He gave me one of his old tweed jackets that was too small for him because the sleeves fitted me perfectly. He never raised his voice. He never humiliated me. He thanked me every single night before bed for my service. I did not know it at the time, but he was watching me. He was measuring me. He had lived 87 years among men of every kind, and he had developed a barrister's instinct for character. In the 7th month, his health began to slip. The walks in the garden became shorter. The chess games ended earlier. He slept more during the day. The doctor came twice a week, and then 3 times. Mrs. Henshaw and I worked out a new rota that meant one of us was always within earshot. In the 9th month, he stopped getting out of bed. I sat with him through the long afternoons. I read to him from Patrick O'Brien. I held a glass of water to his lips. I changed his pajamas when he soiled them, and I did so without any expression on my face that might have shamed him. He had become as light as a child. One evening, he opened those impossibly blue eyes, and he looked at me and he said, "Harold, do you believe a man can be given a second chance at having a son?" I did not know what to say. I said, "I believe a man can be given a second chance at being a father." He smiled. It was the last smile I saw him give. He died at 3:20 the following morning. I was holding his hand. Mrs. Henshaw was on the other side of the bed. Neither of us spoke. The house was utterly silent, except for the ticking of the long case clock in the hall. I attended the funeral. There were perhaps 40 people in attendance, mostly elderly, mostly former colleagues. The nephew flew over from Sydney. The nieces did not come. I sat at the back. I did not speak to anyone. I assumed I would be unemployed by the end of the week, and I had begun, quietly, to look for another position. 3 days after the funeral, a letter arrived for me at the house in Parnell. It was from Mr. Ashbourne's solicitors, a firm called Pemberton Calvert, with offices on Shortland Street. The letter requested my presence at a reading of the will on the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. It said that my attendance was required. I sat in the waiting room of Pemberton Calvert on that Tuesday morning in a borrowed suit, with my hands folded in my lap, and I watched the nephew from Sydney pace back and forth in expensive shoes. He glanced at me twice and decided I was not worth speaking to. The 2 nieces had not come. They had appointed a London solicitor to represent their interests by phone. We were called into the conference room. There was a long table of dark cowrie, much like the one in my old kitchen, polished to a mirror. The senior partner, a Mr. Calvert, sat at the head. He was perhaps 55, lean, careful in his speech. He read the preliminary clauses. He read the list of small bequests. Mrs. Henshaw was to receive $100,000 and the long case clock from the hall. The gardener was to receive $20,000. The cleaner who came on Wednesdays was to receive $10,000. The local Anglican church was to receive $50,000 for the maintenance of the war memorial. Then Mr. Calvert paused. He looked over the top of his glasses at me. He said, "The residue of the estate, comprising the Parnell residence, the holiday house at Pauanui, the share portfolio, and all remaining assets, after the payment of debts and taxes, is bequeathed to Harold Edward Whitcombe." The nephew from Sydney said, "What?" Mr. Calvert said, "In its entirety." Mr. Ashbourne was very specific. He revised the will 11 months ago, shortly after Mr. Whitcombe began employment. He revised it again 3 months ago and confirmed the terms. He was of sound mind on both occasions. The estate is valued at approximately 17 million New Zealand dollars. The nephew from Sydney stood up. He said something I do not remember. He pointed at me. He used the word fraud. He used the word manipulation. He used the word old fool. Mr. Calvert allowed him to finish and then said, very calmly, that any challenge to the will would be vigorously defended. That Mr. Ashbourne had left a videoed statement explaining his decision, and that the videoed statement made specific reference to the indifference of his blood relatives over the preceding 2 decades. The nephew sat down. I said nothing. I could not feel my hands. Mr. Calvert handed me the manila envelope I told you about at the beginning. Inside was the letter from Mr. Ashbourne, written in his own hand, addressed to me. It said only this: Harold, you treated me as a person, not as an inheritance. That is the rarest gift a man can give another man at the end of his life. Use what I leave you to do good, and to remember that worth is not measured by the blood in your veins, but by the conduct of your hours. Yours in friendship, Geoffrey. I sat in that conference room for a long time after the others had left. Mr. Calvert brought me a glass of water. He waited. Eventually, I asked him what I should do next. He said, Mr. Whitcombe, you should go home. He said it kindly. And I realized I did not know which house he meant. The first phone call from Bradley came on the Thursday. I do not know how he found out so quickly, but Auckland is a small town for some kinds of news. I let it ring through to voicemail. The message was almost cheerful. He said, Dad, mate, I have been so worried about you. I thought something terrible had happened. Where on earth have you been? Please call me back. Felicity is beside herself. The grandchildren have been asking after their granddad. The second call came an hour later. The third came that evening. By the end of the weekend, there had been 23. By the end of the following week, there had been 61. The voicemails progressed through worry, then injured feeling, then forced cheerfulness about lunch, then a request to discuss family matters, then a barely controlled demand to know what I had done with the inheritance, then naked accusation, then weeping, then naked accusation again. Felicity left messages too. She used the phrase, your responsibility to family. She used the phrase, the grandchildren's future. She used the phrase, we are willing to forgive and move on. I did not return any of the calls. I did not because I had nothing to say. I had nothing to say because, at 69 years of age, I had finally understood something that should not have taken me so long to learn. Family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the people who share your hours. Geoffrey Ashbourne, in 11 months, had been more of a father to me than I had been able to be to my own son, and Bradley, in 43 years, had earned exactly the regard he had shown me on that Tuesday afternoon in the driveway in Remuera. Mr. Calvert handled the legal matters. The nephew, from Sydney, made a half-hearted challenge that was withdrawn within a month after the videoed statement was reviewed. The nieces in England signed away any claim in exchange for a small ex gratia payment that I suggested myself, because I did not want them to be left with nothing, even though they had been left with nothing by the man who had known them. I moved into the Parnell house. I kept Mrs. Henshaw on, at her full salary, plus a pay rise. I kept the gardener and the cleaner. I did not change the furniture or the wallpaper or the long case clock that no longer chimed because Mrs. Henshaw had taken it home as her bequest. I sat in Geoffrey's wing chair in the evenings, and I read his Patrick O'Brien, and I tried to understand what he had wanted me to do. It took me 3 months to decide. I sold the holiday house at Pauanui because I had no use for it, and I disliked the idea of a second home sitting empty when others had no first one. I used the proceeds and a portion of the share portfolio to establish a charitable trust in the names of Eleanor Whitcombe and Geoffrey Ashbourne. The trust funds emergency accommodation and live-in companionship for elderly people in the Auckland region who have been forced from their homes by family disputes. I called it the Second Chance Trust, after the question Geoffrey had asked me on his last good evening. The 74th call from Bradley came on a Sunday. I picked it up. I do not know why, Perhaps I wanted to hear his voice one final time, as the voice of my son, before I began to think of him as something else. He said, "Dad, please. Please. I know I made mistakes." The pressure was enormous. The business has been hard. Felicity has been struggling. I lashed out, and I should not have. I am so sorry. Please come back. The grandchildren miss their granddad. We are family. I let him speak until he ran out of words. Then I said, "Bradley, I forgive you. I want you to hear me say that, and I want you to know that I mean it. I forgive you, because carrying anger at 69 is a luxury I cannot afford. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and it is not the same as returning. I will not be coming back. I will not be giving you any portion of what I have been given, because what I have been given was not given to me to give to you. It was given to me to use as Geoffrey would have wished. And Geoffrey did not know you, and what Geoffrey did know of you, through me, did not move him to generosity. The grandchildren are welcome to write to me. If they wish to visit when they are older and choosing for themselves, I will welcome them. But you and Felicity will not be welcome in my home. And we will not be sharing meals. And we will not be a family in the way you mean. I wish you well. I hope you find peace. I hope you become a better man than the one who slapped me in his driveway. Good night, son." I hung up the telephone. He rang back twice. I did not answer. He has not rung again in the 8 months since. I am 69 years old now, and I am writing this from the desk in the upstairs study of the house in Parnell, looking out onto the magnolia tree that Geoffrey planted with his own hands in 1972. Mrs. Henshaw has just brought up a pot of tea. There is a fire in the grate downstairs because winter has come in proper now and the southerly is rattling the windows. The Second Chance Trust has, as of last week, helped 107 elderly New Zealanders find safe accommodation away from family situations that were doing them harm. I keep the letters in a drawer of this desk, and on the days when I miss Eleanor most acutely, I take them out and I read them. If you have listened this far, perhaps you are a man or a woman who has been treated by your own children the way I was treated by mine. Perhaps you are afraid to leave because you have nowhere to go. Perhaps you are telling yourself, as I told myself for too many months, that family is family and that you must endure. I want to say this to you, plainly, with the authority of someone who has been where you are and walked out the other side. You are not obliged to be diminished by the people you raised. The duty of a parent is to give a child every chance to become a good person. But the becoming is the child's work, not yours. If they have chosen to become cruel, that choice is theirs, and the consequences of that choice are also theirs to bear. You are permitted to leave. You are permitted to start again. You are permitted to find, in the unlikeliest of places, a friend who sees you as a whole person and not as a burden or a bank balance. A house is not made of brick and timber. A house is made of the people inside it who are glad you are there. If the people inside your house are not glad you are there, then it is not your house, no matter whose name is on the deed. Be careful what you sign in the weeks after a great loss, because grief makes us trusting in ways that grief should not. Read every page. Ask a solicitor who is not chosen by the person asking you to sign. Keep your own counsel for at least 6 months before making any major decision about your home or your money. Eleanor would have told me this if she had been alive to tell me. I am telling you now, on her behalf, because she cannot. And finally this. If you have raised a child who has grown into a person you do not recognize, you are not the cause of who they have become. You are not required to keep paying for a person who is no longer the child you raised. Love them if you can from a distance. Pray for them, if you are the praying sort, but do not give them your last years. Your last years belong to you. The kettle is whistling downstairs. Mrs. Henshaw will be wondering where I have got to. The fire needs another log. There is a chest set on the table by the window. And tonight, a young man named Samuel from the Second Chance Trust is coming to play me a game. He is 24. He is studying social work. He reminds me sometimes, in the angle of his jaw and the way he laughs, of the boy Bradley used to be before he became whatever it is he is now. I am teaching Samuel the Sicilian defense. He is teaching me how to use a smartphone. We are, in our small way, family. That is the end of my story. Thank you for staying with me to the end of it. May your evenings be peaceful. May your hours be your own. And may you find, even in the late autumn of your life, a chair by a fireplace that is glad to hold you.